So people who used to just go to church once or twice a year, we call them Christmas and Easter Christians, they're now not saying that they're a Christian anymore. They're now saying, hey, I'm just kind of nothing. Like that's just a valid option now for a lot of people, which is fine. We know people like this. They're really good moral people. They may be great parents and great coworkers, but they're not really followers of Jesus. And yet, as people that want to see the world change for Christ, have a desire for that in our heart, we sometimes wonder how to interact with them, to interact with the culture around us, to be people that see ourselves as missionaries to our culture. That's a big deal here at Green Hills. Like we think that we're not just called here just to live 80 years and have some great adventures and get some good pictures and eat some good food and go see some cool things, live the millennial dream. We're not called just to do that, right? We're called to be people who are sent to our communities. So as somebody that grew up on the mission field, I grew up in Bogota, Colombia. My parents were missionaries there for 30 years. Yes, we were there during all the bad times, the bad old days, where there was like, instead of snow days when we would go to school, there was assassination and bombing days. We couldn't go out because it was too dangerous for us to kind of show our faces in the streets. In that time, I understood what it meant to be a missionary, to be somebody who was sent to another country to go start churches and to share about Jesus. And what I've found is that Americans have lost that sense of mission in America. Like we just kind of see that this is all Christianity, and now that's becoming revealed that it's definitely not. And so there needs to be like a recalibration of the way that we see our world, the way that we see our workplace, our communities, our homes, to now see our city as a mission field. That God has sent us to Nashville, Tennessee, so that people would come to know and love Jesus, which is what this church is really all about. So we kind of see ourselves as sent as missionaries. And today we're going to look at what it looks like to live out this counterculture, to be Christians in the world, to be people who live in our communities, and that we're doctors and lawyers and students and professors and teachers, and yet we're Christians in all of that. Like, how do we do that? And we're going to see some things on how to do that well today as we look at one of the pivotal moments in human history as we see the Babylonian Empire fall. It's the last night of the Babylonian Empire in our text, and we're going to see what it looks like to be a person that lives for Jesus in a very quickly changing community, quickly changing times. And the first thing we're going to find is this, that we need to be people who declare a better reality to the world. That we are called to be people who declare a better reality to the world. So we're going to walk through this story today. The story of a man named Belshazzar, a king, who sees his world absolutely end, and he's faced with a different reality that is coming. And we're going to start right here in verse 1. It says this, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. And then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of the God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So we're starting here because this is the beginning of this story, but it's really not the beginning of the entire story we've been looking at. This story is embedded in the book of Daniel because there's some history here. Now, this king, Belshazzar, is the king of the greatest kingdom the world has ever seen, the kingdom of Babylon. He rules a city-state that has conquered the entire known world up to this point. So the city of Babylon is this massive fortress. It's a place unlike anything anybody's ever seen before. It's something unlike we've ever seen before, actually. It's a walled city. The walls of the city are almost 40 feet tall. If you saw the movie Troy, the Brad Pitt movie several years ago, think about that. In fact, it's actually a bigger, more powerful city than Troy in that you could actually race chariots on top of the walls. Like, it's that big. Nobody's ever taken Babylon. It's a place that seems absolutely secure. They have more than enough drinking water. There's actually a river that goes right through the city, so everybody has enough water to get something to drink anytime they want. The city's been fortified. There's food for years within the city. And so there's this massive city that's indestructible. It can never be taken. And Belshazzar throws a feast this night, a party like you've probably never been to, a party for over 1,000 people, all of his best and brightest in the city. And he does this because he's absolutely declaring something about who he is. Now, what he's declaring is that he's now the king. He's declaring that he's a king that can never be toppled. Now, this is fitting because at this point, there's a lot of things that are going on in the kingdom that would seem to indicate otherwise. First of all, his father, who used to be the king, a guy named Nabonidus, had just been defeated by this new emerging empire called the Persian Empire. And the Medes and the Persians have been kind of like encroaching on King Belshazzar's land. They just took his father out back behind the woodshed and just stomped him. And now this kingdom, this new kingdom, has come to Babylon, and they've set up shop around the city, and they have surrounded it. So now the city, that this massive, untouchable, unconquerable city, has an army around it for the very first time in its existence. And King Belshazzar is now both saying that he's now the new guy in charge. He's now the new king. He's throwing this big coronation party. And he's also trying to rally the troops saying, listen, no one can ever take us. And so he throws this big party, and then he crosses a line that he never thought was a line that he didn't even care about, which is that he offends the God of the Israelites, the one true God. And he does it by bringing in certain items from the worship of God and using them for his own pleasure. So he throws this huge party. Everybody who is important is there. Think about like the Met Gala or something like that. There's the red carpet. Everybody's having a great time. And Belshazzar says, hey, listen, we need to spruce this thing up a little bit. Listen, I remember there's some gold vessels for this small god out in the middle of nowhere, this place called Jerusalem that we conquered a long time ago. So let's celebrate our superiority over all the gods by bringing this out and just drinking from these cups and goblets that are really only meant to be made for the worship of God. So he does that. And now the story changes. Let's continue in verse 5. It says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. And then the king's color changed and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way and his knees knocked together. So this is a very fitting story for this time of year. It's very Halloween-esque, right? They're having this party, and all of a sudden a hand appears out of nowhere, a disembodied hand, and starts writing on the wall. And the king starts freaking out. In fact, it says that his knees tremble. He's not scared of the army outside of the gates, but he is terrified of this hand, which you would be too. Let's just be honest, right? So like if you're at a party and you're having a good time with your friends, all of a sudden a disembodied hand shows up and starts writing on the wall, you'd be like, this is called Ghostbusters or something, right? You'd be absolutely freaking out, which happens to the king. So he calls out for help, his version of Ghostbusters, which are the enchanters, his magicians. It says the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me the interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. So the king says, okay, there's this inscription. He sees this hand. There's a new writing on the wall now. He sees these words that have been written by this mysterious hand, by some being that's different than him, and he wonders what to do. So he calls all his best guys, his smartest guys, his enchanters, the guys who are the proto-scientists of his day, and says, hey, figure this out. This is a mystery. We don't know what's happening here among us, but we know there's an army outside. We saw a miraculous sign on the wall, and none of us can make sense of these words. Please tell us what it is. And this is something that's important for us to realize as we're looking at reality around us, as people who live in a world that is different than us, is that there are mysteries that the world has. There's a different reality that sometimes seems invisible to us. Sometimes we can go along with our life. We just see things as being completely secular, and yet there's something divine that is around us. There's a different reality that we testify to. And every once in a while, these things that are invisible become visible, and the world begins to wonder. We find a conundrum here. The king has all the power that he could ever want. He has the kingdom, and yet he can't control the world around him. And every once in a while, you're going to find people, maybe you're going to run into this yourself, where you're going to be going through your life, and you think you have it all figured out, and you're like moving through it, and you've got it handled. You've got your career. It's going great. Your family is doing fine. Your kids are doing great. You've had everything you've ever wanted. And then life throws you a curveball and you don't know how to deal with it. It could be cancer. It could be that you lose your job. It could be that you lose your spouse. You don't know what you're going to do next. This is the reality of the world. The world is something that is unpredictable. And there are parts of it that we can't make sense in our nice, neat, tidy compartments of life. And this is where this man finds himself, Belshazzar. He tells his men, listen, if you tell me what the inscription is, I'll elevate you above everybody else. He says that he'll make him the third highest ruler in the land, which means that beyond him and his father, this person's in charge of everything next. They give him a beautiful coat, which is purple. Most of us don't think purple's that big of a deal these days, but in that day, it was actually the highest level of design and fashion that you could possibly have. It signified that you were royalty. So the stakes are high. This man is desiring to find out what's going on. He's willing to do anything to figure out what is going on in his world as he sees this invisible hand kind of make this happen. Now, as he's perplexed, the story continues. Verse 10 says, the queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom were like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers because of an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So the queen mother, it's probably Belshazzar's mom, shows up and she says, hey, listen, Belshazzar, there's actually another guy. His name is Daniel, and you've kind of forgotten about him because he's been retired for a while. This is what's happened to Daniel. He's kind of moved on. He's in semi-retirement, or he's kind of out of the scene. And this queen says, hey, there's this stud that could actually interpret stuff like this. Let's bring him out of retirement and help us in this moment. And so they do. And you find Daniel coming before the queen, and he has an opportunity to speak to everybody about a different reality, something that's different. And you find something about Daniel here is that you see this description of who he is, that I think it's a good template for us as we look at our perspective on the world. See, sometimes Christians struggle trying to figure out how to deal with their community, with their experience outside of church, right? So we come into church, we're like, cool, I know what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to sing, and I'm supposed to know my Bible, and I'm supposed to be religious and talk to God, and I can do that here, and I can do that in my quiet times, and I can maybe go on a men's retreat or women's retreat. I can go do that, or when I'm in a small group. I know the way that I should act as a Christian. But when I get into my regular life, when I'm at the gym, I'm hanging out with my friends, or I'm online, like how do I live as a Christian? Have you ever thought that? I mean, I know some of you guys may be like a part of a Christian organization, nonprofit, or Lifeway, or whatever, and so that doesn't even occur to you, right? But like for the rest of us, like how do you do that well? How do you do that? Well, Christians for years have like struggled with that. So some people have tried to hide from the culture. They're like, okay, we're just gonna hide, and so I'm gonna hide my Christianity from my community. I'm just not gonna show anybody that I'm a Christian. I'm just gonna act like everybody else. I'm just gonna like hide behind policy. This is what policy says I should do, so I'm just gonna do that. Or even some Christians have tried to hide from the world. My mom is from a part of America, a place called Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And in Lancaster County, there's this whole community of people who are Christians who've said, we're just going to hide from the world. We call them Amish. And they're just like, listen, we're just not going to go with the rest of you guys. So I know you guys are like getting smartphones and electricity. We're just not going to do that. We're going to still dress the way we did when we first moved to America. And we're going to continue to speak German. We're not even going to learn English. Like just a few of us will do that, but we're not going to go with the rest of culture. We're going to hide from it. But Christians do the same thing. We just create our own little cultures where we hide from the rest of the world. We do our Christian stuff. We listen to Christian music. We read Christian books. Nothing wrong with those things, but we just kind of hide sometimes behind these Christian communities. We eat Christian chicken, Chick-fil-A, right? We just kind of do our own things. We just kind of like, just have our own little Christian subculture. We hide from the world. I don't know, it's taking our ball and just gone home. Like, all right, you guys aren't playing by the rules. I'm going to go home. There's other Christians who fight the culture. They become culture warriors. So they're not going to hide. They're actually going to be like, we're going to make America a Christian country, and we're going to live by the Bible. And we're mad when it's not like that. And they get mad when when non-Christians don't act like Christians. And so they start trying to like take the country back. So I fight all the cultural engagement wars. And listen, it's great that our country has a long reputation for being a people that have loved God. That's beautiful. But America is not Israel. Can we just admit that? And America is a wonderful place. But you can't legislate religion. It's never worked. So how do you do something that's different? Well, I think we don't need to be people that fight the culture. And we don't need to be people who hide from the culture. I think, in fact, the best way to reach a culture is not hiding from it or fighting it, but to lovingly testify to it. The best way to reach a culture is not to hide from it or to fight it, but to lovingly testify to it. So to be somebody who's in the world and yet not of it, and to speak out against the things that wound and offend God. Say, this is not the way that humanity should thrive. Let's show a different way of living and yet not hate it, but love it. See, I think sometimes Christians get a bad rap because it seems like we hate the world. We're like, oh, it's terrible. But that's not what Christians ought to be about. We should be people that love it like Jesus did. Not embrace it by taking on all of its culture, but be people who testify to a different and better reality that God is doing. He's calling us to be people who reflect the glory of God in our daily life. And so you find Daniel doing this, where he's somebody who this queen remembers years later, like, hey, this guy was somebody who did his job really, really well. He was excellent. He was the best magician we've ever had. And he wasn't even a magician. He was the best one we had, and he did his job in excellence. And therefore, when we have this time of crisis, let's bring him out of retirement because he's somebody who lived different. Listen, wouldn't it be wonderful if the people that you work with were like, you know what? That person must have an incredible God because of the way that they work. Their character is above reproach. The way that they love other people, man, it's amazing. It's excellent. Because here's the thing. The way that you live your life, you are testifying about the kind of God that you follow when you interact with your coworkers and when you talk to people in the street. The way that you live your life shows what you really think about God and what you think about others. And Daniel models this as he declares a better reality in the way that he lives his life. Now, the second thing that he does is he lives a life that is submitted to the Most High God. Not only does he declare a different reality, but he lives a life that is submitted to the Most High God. And Belshazzar, this king, does not. Now we find Daniel coming before the king, verse 13. It says, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I've heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that the light of an understanding, excellent wisdom is found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me an interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretations, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. So this section just kind of like advances the story. Like Daniel comes and the king's like, all right, same deal for those guys as for you. You tell me what's up there, you're going to be rewarded. Now, Daniel says this, verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. Listen, this statement that Daniel says is absolutely one of the most courageous things you've ever read. He tells the most powerful person in his world that he can just keep his money. He says, listen, king, you just keep your gifts. Give that to somebody else. But I'll still tell you what it means. Then we find Daniel revealing the kind of character that made him somebody that they would even want to bring into this place at all because he's someone who's willing to tell the truth when nobody else is, regardless of the reward. See, sometimes we want to advance ourselves so much so that we're willing to compromise. But Daniel's like, listen, I can't be bought. I'm going to tell you the truth either way. I'm going to tell you what these words say on the wall, but I am unwilling to compromise what they say so that can be rewarded. This is a person who lives his life submitted to the Most High God. His identity is connected to a God that will outlive this king, that preceded this king, and so he's going to live a life that's different. And this is so hard for us because we always, not always, but many times, live with fear of what other people think about us. Have you ever felt that way? That's why junior high must have been really hard for a lot of us, right? Like you just want to just look like everybody else. You want people to like you. This is something I found that actually goes beyond just junior high and high school. This still happens, right? We still want people to like us. We don't want to be disliked. And so Daniel here actually shows something different. He's like, listen, King, I don't even care. But I'll tell you what it is. Because I live my life submitted to a different king, not you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 18, he goes on to say what that king is about and why this guy's failing. It says, O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. Daniel points back to King Belshazzar's grandfather. He calls him his father. That's just an ancient way of just saying, like, hey, this guy was your ancestor. He says, God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, everything. He says, and because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive, and whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. I think it's interesting. Like Daniel says, like your grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, was this great man, not just because he was a talented freak of nature at being a great king. It's because God allowed him to have that position of leadership. See, sometimes you can feel like I can't get along any further in my career because I just have this bottleneck. God may actually be putting that in your life because he's wanting to do something in you. Or that may not be the story that he wants to tell through you. But ultimately, success or failure comes down to what God wants to do in you. And so it's impossible to try to be somebody else. You need to live the story that God wants you to live yourself. And here you find Nebuchadnezzar being somebody that God incredibly blessed. But God was doing that because he wanted to do something in Nebuchadnezzar. We find out that this, verse 30, says, but when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened, so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind, and his mind was made to be like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. We saw this last week. Pastor Justin preached this message that Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest king the world had ever seen, was so proud that God humbled him because God was going to teach him and eternity that there's really one king. And he puts other kings in place, but those kings are not ultimately sovereign over all things. And God made Nebuchadnezzar, basically, if you read the story, go absolutely insane for several years to reveal that it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar who placed himself on the throne in the first place, that God was the one who elevated him into leadership. And Daniel saw that, and it marked Daniel's life so strongly that Daniel's at a place where he doesn't care what happens to him because his hope is fully placed in God. Christian, you're a Christian in this room. You serve that same God. And that ought to give you confidence in the way that you live your life, to live a life of integrity and boldness because you serve him and not your employer. You serve him and not the way that other people think about you. You serve a God who sets up kings and brings them down. And that means that you need to live your life to please him and not some other person. This is something that I have to preach to myself. Can I just be honest? It is so hard to really live in this. Because, man, I just feel like sometimes I just want people to like me more than I want God to like me because God's so distant. It's like, yeah, I generally know God likes me. But the person near me, I just need them to like me. I need my boss to like me. But Daniel is pointing to this reality that the person that really matters is God. And Daniel owns that. And then he points to Belshazzar and says, that's not you, though. Verse 22, he says, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this, but you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath and whose are all your ways you have not honored. Daniel just throws down the hammer. It's like, the God who gave you life, you're not honoring. You're worshiping something else. Therefore, God is displeased. We are called to live our lives submitted to the Most High God. And God is watching us. Which brings us to our third point, is that we must live with an awareness that God will judge how we live. How you live. We need to live with an awareness that God is watching and that God will judge how you live. This is not something that Americans are like, yes and amen, praise Jesus. None of us want to live a life where we're being judged by God. But what we find next is that God is judging this king. And every single one of us, in some way, are like Belshazzar, in that God is watching and he is wondering if we're going to follow him or not. Verse 34. Then from God's presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. This is what Daniel says. And this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. There's 4 words that are on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And this is the interpretation, Daniel says. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Judgment comes to Belshazzar. God tells him that he has been wanting in his leadership, but primarily in his relationship with God. Therefore, the kingdom has been taken from him and it's been given to somebody else. See, here's the thing. Everything we have at some point will be somebody else's. The house you live in, someday somebody else will own it. The job you have, someday somebody else will have it. Your life and my life are very, very fleeting, and we live underneath the gracious mercy of God. God is calling us to be people who look and respond to him and not worship the thing that he has given us. See, this is what Belshazzar has failed in. He started worshiping the things that he can see and touch, the things that are around him, the gods of gold and silver, the things that are around him, more than the invisible God who gave him all those things. And Daniel says, listen, here's the deal. Everything is going to be taken away from you, and you are someone who's been judged by God. Our story ends with this, verse 29. It says, then Belshazzar gives the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So what we see is that Belshazzar says, okay, cool, Daniel, I'm going to elevate you. Daniel knows that it's not even going to last that night. And then that very night, the city falls and Belshazzar loses his life and the city is given to somebody else. But history tells us, it's not here in this text, but there's plenty of historical evidence that night the city falls and the world changes. The city that seems so unstoppable has a sneak attack as the party is going on. See, as they're throwing this feast and as they're hanging out and they think they're having a great time, and as the handwriting starts coming on the wall, the king outside the city, King Cyrus, has come up with an incredible plan. The city was on this river. It's this huge walled city, and the river is huge. Like, think about the Mississippi, okay? About that big. The Euphrates River. And it seems like nobody can enter into the river. The river's high, it's dangerous, nobody can hardly swim, so it's a safe space for them. But Cyrus comes up with this incredible plan. He goes upstream and builds a dam and sends the river into a swamp. Nobody saw that coming, right? They were like, what, you could do that, right? And they divert the river, and in the middle of the night, while everybody's partying, soldiers kind of go like a Trojan horse, right? Right up into the city, right up this highway that used to be the river. And they take the city in a night. And God brings judgment on Babylon. And so you find this story being a cool story. The city falls. In fact, you go deeper, I actually totally geeked out. There's this whole epic story that's behind the scenes where this guy comes in and kills the king because his son was killed by the king. And there's this whole movie that's waiting to be made here. If anybody wants to make it, I'll tell you the script, okay? We don't have time here. It's like this thing when you start studying, you're like, oh, wow, that's just blows my mind. I told Pastor Justin this morning, he's like, oh, man, I just need to go read this. We just started geeking out, Bible geek on all this stuff. But all that doesn't matter. What really matters is that this king ran into the true king and he was found wanting. And he found judgment because he was unwilling to bend the knee to the king of the universe. So in this way, King Belshazzar is actually a picture or stand-in for our own life, that we are people who live our life pursuing our own interests, and someday there will be a reckoning. So what do we do? The Bible talks about this all the time as the ultimate issue for every man, woman, and child, that every single one of us has sinned. We've worshiped the idols rather than God. We've taken what he's given us and we've worshiped it instead of him. And we have not been people who've said, I'm going to trust God with the very breath that's in my lungs. I'm not going to be that person. I'm going to pursue my life. And some of us say, man, I've never really done that. I've not been rebellious. I just didn't know. God says, you're even not knowing is an element of you rejecting me. Romans 3:23 is one of the most well-known passages in the entire scriptures. I learned it when I was trying to learn how to share the gospel with people, because it's a hammer. It says this, Romans 3:23, it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Now, that passage is famous. If you've gone to any kind of evangelism training, if you've memorized any stack of verses, you'll have to learn that one. And you've just learned what it means. It says that every single one of us has messed up and we cannot meet God's righteous standard. That's incredibly bad news. And when I read that, sometimes I'm like, man, that's true of me. I don't know how to get around that. There's obviously an important truth for me to learn. And so sometimes just get fixated on that, feel just this weight of shame and just judgment on me. I don't know how to get around it. But one of the things that we miss when we look at this verse, in fact, I was reminded about that this week when I was studying, is that sometimes we read it and we read it like this. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, period. Right? End of story. But if you look at the Greek text in Romans, or just look at your Bible, you'll notice that it doesn't have a period there. What does it have? Just go look with me if you want. Romans 3:23. It's a comma. It says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, comma. Verse 24, the very next verse, says this, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. We find something that is more surprising than we could imagine. We face judgment. We fail. We worship the creation instead of the creator. And God has given us a way out in Jesus. Scriptures say that we are justified by his grace as a gift. This is a fancy word. Justification means that God says, you, in my sight, are declared righteous. Just as if you never had done it. You have been declared righteous. What this means is that God says that you have the same holiness that God does because of Jesus. In fact, you see that here in this text. It says, there's redemption in Christ Jesus because God put him forward as a propitiation by his blood to receive by faith. This idea of propitiation is one that's hard for us to understand because we don't use that language very often. Like you've probably never used that word propitiation in a sentence ever. So we may go, I think I know what it means, but what does it really mean? The idea of propitiation is a technical one, and it can't just be like substituted for something else. This idea of propitiation means that we had a blood debt to God because of our sin, and God placed Jesus on the cross so that his blood would be shed instead of ours. That God paid our debt to God that caused us to be people who had judgment in our life and eternal separation, and God paid it in Jesus and covered the wrath of God over our failure to be paid by the blood of someone who is innocent. And this is what God offers us in the cross. This is the fundamental story of Christianity. You can't teach a text like this cool story in Daniel, without looking at the greater story, which is this, is that we are all Belshazzar. We are all people who set ourselves up as king of our own life, and it comes to a bitter end, and yet in Jesus, God gives us a way to redeem the story and to live. Because God took our punishment for us. So the last thing I want us to just revel in this morning as we're thinking about people who live out of counterculture, the last thing is to embrace God's grace. Not only are we called to live and declare a better reality of the world, not only are we to submit our life to the Most High God, not only are we to live with an awareness that God will judge how we live, but we are to embrace the grace of God that he offers us. And I want to press in on this right here, Christian. If you've been a Christian for a while, it's easy to replace the grace of God that he offers you with works. Like, I believe in the grace of God. Now I need to make sure that I do the right things. And if you've done that long enough, you've probably become tired and disillusioned with Christianity or following Jesus because you've been following something different than Christianity. Because Christianity means you continue to just embrace the grace of God, realizing that you can't be good enough to be saved on your own merit. And you need to continue to say, I still need the grace of God because I continue to go follow other things. So Jesus, save me. Embrace me. Fill my heart with love for you so that I don't want those things anymore. So Christian, for some of us, as we close today, I just think you need to hear that. You need to embrace the grace of God that he offers you freely to just say, I want Jesus. There's some of us in this room who we've departed from the faith or we never had it. And you've been in a place where you're like, man, listen, I don't know if I believe this anymore. I never did. But you need to know that there is good news for you today, that today Jesus is offering a way for you to come to him without conditions, without you trying to figure it out. He's coming today offering himself. That you can know him and experience grace and escape death forever. So Christian, embrace God's grace. Seeker, embrace God's grace. You may have been trying to satisfy yourself with the world, and you feel it today that it does not satisfy. And Jesus is offering you something different, a new kind of life where you live on mission to make God known among your city so that others can live. We have a song that I want us to respond to, and I want you just to consider it as you worship and as you respond with your heart. To just say, Jesus, I'm going to trust you with my life. Some of us in this room, honestly, you've never done that. You've never done that. You've gone to church camps and you've gone to church functions and you've gone to church your whole life, but you have never fully submitted your life to Jesus. You've never done that. If you're really honest, you can play the part as a good Christian man or woman, but you've never embraced the grace of God in your life. Because I know what it feels like to be that person, because I was that person. I was a young man growing up in church, knew all the answers, and Jesus was not the Lord of my life. And when I gave him my life, everything changed. Christian, are you living a life where you're trying to prove to God how much he should love you and not realizing how much he does love you? Today, as we enter this time of worship, would you just say, Jesus, again, I accept your grace because I want to know you. I want more of you. I want to live for you. Let's pray. Jesus, fill us, heal us, save us, live in us, move us to be people who lovingly testify to every single person, man, woman, child that we meet, that you are better. Pray this in your name.